Hi everyone! I am switching to Tegrity for this week. I have been having some difficulties technologically with Fuse, so please bear with me as I make this switch. This is my first time using Tegrity. So there's some adjustment going on. Today we'll be talking about the history of computer practice. First, just a little feedback on last week's activities. Overall, all the activities were great. The ones that I have graded so far, there are a few left to be graded, but for the most part, everyone did a good job. On the reflection, just a reminder, of course, double check grammar, and make sure you're pulling back the assignment as much as possible to examples within the videos and within the text if it's appropriate. For this example, specifically pulling back examples to the video. Just making sure you're having examples as much as possible to really support you. So now I'll just go ahead and jump into the historical roots of macro practice. I will start by saying that we will have our first lecture quiz this week. So pull out your pen and paper. I'll tell you the questions as we go along, give you the answers, just making sure that people are watching the full lecture. So when we think about macro practice, we're really going to go back to that colonial period. 1600 to 1800, people were first coming to the country. America was this land of abundant resources. And people really saw that there was this whole room for growth. There was so much land growth, personal growth that was available in this new country. And people really saw poverty as a personal misfortune and not a public responsibility. They kind of had this Puritan work ethic that you were really supposed to be dependent upon yourself and not the entire country to take care of you. But that really started to shift in the 1800s. So we had the Industrial Revolution from 1800 to 1870. And this is when we saw mass migration, not only to the United States, but shifting from rural to urban areas. So this is when we had a lot of high immigration, and the immigrants were primarily coming to city centers. They were coming to urban areas, and a lot of rural workers were also shifting to urban areas because that's where the jobs were. So we see economic boom. The United States is booming during this period of time, but in the same period, we're seeing a shift to social responsibility and shift towards more civic engagement. People are really starting to see that maybe we do need to be taking care of one another. And the reason is people aren't in rural areas anymore where you're living on a farm by yourself, your closest neighbor is a few miles away. Everyone is in urban areas, living very close to one another, and they can really see the problems of their neighbors a lot closer because they're right there. So these urban problems are becoming much more apparent, whereas poverty was certainly an issue previously. When you're in rural areas and your neighbor's a few miles away, you can't see it. So now that we have these workers moving to the city centers, they're seeing the problems that their fellow Americans are facing. So there's going to be more charities, more religious organizations that are springing up during this period of time to provide social assistance. This is when Americans are really starting to join associations. So if we think about different women's clubs, churches are kind of expanding during this period of time because they're closer in proximity. So it's easier for Americans to join the associations. Transportation isn't as much of an issue because they're a lot closer. And specifically, they're joining voluntary associations to solve social problems. So question number 1 is, during what period did Americans begin to join voluntary social problems? The first period of time. The Industrial Revolution made way for the settlement movement. So roughly 1870. What happened during this period is, following the Industrial Revolution, the economy started to decline. Having the influx of workers, we're still having an influx of immigrants, but poverty is in a lot more. And this is when community-based associations spring up even more. Rising unions formed during this period, the League of Women Voters, the Shriners Association, the NAACP. From 1925, during this 50-year period, we're seeing so many more associations spring up to solve social problems. This is also when the settlement movement within social work was beginning. So social workers were living amongst the poor. They were providing services such as healthcare, daycare, education. And these services were being provided by primarily middle-class women. So we have a lot more community-based associations that are springing up to solve social problems. Again, social problems are being addressed by the community, by a lot of women. So it's being kind of formed by people working together. A lot of churches are providing support during this period of time as well. Then from there, we're in the Great Depression and the New Deal. So while it was mostly, these community groups that were providing random aid to individuals, as we move into the Great Depression of the late 1920s, being poor was so widespread that it became apparent that it's not a result of malfunctioning of society or of individual malfunctioning. It's really just kind of bad luck on the part of the individual, and it's really so tied to the economy that these people don't have jobs. So this is when social services started to shift towards the government arena. So the government started to provide support. We can see in FDR's New Deal starting to create jobs. It's becoming more of the government's responsibility to help people in need. One of the important things during this period of time, during the Great Depression, is it's mostly still local and state governments that are providing that support. So it's not as widespread on the federal level, mostly state and local governments. So question number 2 for your quiz is, during what time period did the government begin to provide social services? And it's during the Great Depression that the government really started to step in. And we can see in this graph that, as I mentioned, that federal funding really came later. That if we look at this, the gray is local spending on welfare, the green is state spending, and the red is federal spending. The purple at the bottom is the transfer from from the federal to state and local government. So that if we think about CHIP, Medicaid, Medicare, the federal government is giving money to state and local governments to spend. But if we look at the top half of that, you can see that the federal government in red didn't really start to kick into spending until the late 1930s. Before that, it was really state and local governments, and even in the 1930s, it wasn't that much compared to how much the federal government spends now on welfare. It's not really until we get into the 1960s that the federal government is fully engaged in providing social welfare services. This next graph is showing differences in the type of welfare spending. How is the government spending money? The first is in purple. The biggest chunk is on family and child services. Housing is in red and unemployment is in green. And we can see that for the most part, a lot of the government spending is on helping family and children, especially in the beginning. That's really all it was, is their focus was on helping specifically mothers and children, unwed mothers. During times of economic recessions, that's when you see the peak in unemployment. But when the economy is booming, the government starts to pull back. So that's why we see so many peaks, and that's why unemployment benefits are most impacted by the recession. Family and child services does have some peaks, but it's not as prevalent as those unemployment benefits. So if we think about macro practice today, and kind of where it's gone from the Great Depression, when the government first started to provide welfare services, we see now that it's really a combination of organizations, communities, and the public arena, the government, who are kind of pulling their resources together to provide meaningful change in an individual's life. So it's not just on the federal side where it was in the 60s. It's not just these community organizations where it was during the settlement movement. It's a combination of these different structures. And if we go back to this slide here, if we think about these shifts in government spending, the federal government really started to become involved in community support during the 1960s. And this was during LBJ's Great Society program. So he had a lot of services similar to FDR's New Deal to really solve those economic inequalities. He really saw for the first time the government's really acknowledging that we have all of these divisions by race specifically, so many racial divisions, and we need to solve these problems because the government isn't doing anything but really perpetuating this problem. So that's when we see this influx of government welfare spending, and it only kind of increases from there. It's pulled back a little on the government side in the 1990s. You can kind of see a dip there, and that's when President Clinton had welfare reform in 1996, so that pulled back on welfare spending. But it definitely peaked again in the mid-2000s during that Great Recession. So question number 3 is, what was the name of LBJ's program to address widespread economic inequalities? And the name of that program was the Great Society program. So this was the federal government, one of the first times they really kind of stepped into the macro community practice arena to solve these problems. So again, if we kind of look at where we are today, compared to where we were previously, we're seeing that first and foremost, people aren't engaged as much in their local churches and community associations. So in the late 1800s, when we saw that, so many problems were being addressed or tried to address by these community associations, Women's League, if we think about the Shriners, all of those other associations have really been on the decline. And church membership is also on the decline. So while churches have provided so much social services previously, churches were kind of the center point for a lot of life for individuals, and they were providing daycare, counseling to individuals, and church membership is also on the decline. So replacing those has been nonprofits, really. So where church and community organizations have stepped back, nonprofits have stepped in to fill their place. And nonprofits have been able to do that because of the rise in charitable giving. So there's been an increase in philanthropic giving over the past several decades. And of course, a lot has changed also because of changes in technology. So while you used to have to go door to door to get people to sign up to vote, now we can text people, we can call people. Things are a lot easier when we have all of this engagement opportunities online. So people are choosing to be a lot more civically engaged online rather than being a part of these community associations. When I can sit in my house and do it, might as well. So we can see in this chart the difference in philanthropic giving, how philanthropic giving has increased dramatically between 1975 and 2015. So the fourth question is, how has philanthropic giving changed over time? It has increased. And you can see in this graph that there's been a lot more nonprofit organizations this is from 1968 to 2000. There's just been, it's like the number has almost doubled in like a 20-year, 30-year period of time. So a lot more nonprofit associations are springing up. Additionally, this is kind of showing civic engagement is moving online. So this is looking at the differences between individuals who are social network users. In the column to the left, column to the right is adults who aren't using social networking, and individuals who are online on social networks are much more civically engaged than individuals who are off social networks. So they're encouraging people to vote. They're more likely to read political stories and post links to political stories to other people. They're more involved in social issues. They're just a lot more connected, and that's how people are kind of choosing to be involved. If we think about, just these movements we've had on Twitter and Facebook, so many of them have sprung up through online engagement. Just mass movements, mass protests have really sprung up because of the ability to connect people so much faster through technology. So while previously our community work was really started by these patchwork community organizations, it's really shifted more to the nonprofit and public institutions. The federal government is spending more now on welfare than they've ever before. We have more nonprofits than we've ever before. And I would guess that a part of this, it's definitely associated with, there's been more women working. So as women are no longer, stay-at-home moms, a lot of them are working more. So before, while these community associations might have been comprised primarily of stay-at-home moms, they're working more. So instead of giving back to the community by being a part of these being a part of these community associations, they're donating their money to nonprofit organizations. So people are really shifting their money to these paid nonprofit positions and paid positions in the public sector to support people around them, rather than having informal support from individuals through community associations. There's been a decline in volunteerism rates among working age populations. Individuals who are younger and aren't working, they're still volunteering and supporting nonprofit associations, but people in that working age aren't volunteering as much as they used to. So they're choosing to remain involved both philanthropically by donating money to organizations and through social media and other less time-intensive activities. Okay, so your activities for this week. Oh, it should say week 2 activities. I apologize. Week 2 activities. We are in week 2. Just a reminder, these are required. There are points assigned to all of these, so make sure you are doing them. First, we have our lecture quiz, which is on Blackboard. Everything is posted on Blackboard in the week 2 folder. The lecture quiz on the 4 questions that I presented to you throughout the lecture. The second is watch the video Activating a Generation. It's only like 10 minutes long. It's pretty engaging. It just kind of takes you through the time of how technology has kind of shifted getting people involved civically. So watch the movie, think about the video, the readings, the lecture. Also consider current events, what's going on right now in the community. And in roughly 2 pages, answer, do you think technology is good or bad for community engagement? And how can nonprofits use technology to further connect the community to their mission? So use some examples and submit it. It is due on Thursday, February 1st at 11:59 p.m. Everything is always due on Thursday, 11:59 p.m. So most importantly, you have a large assignment that is due on February 1st, or the first piece of your large assignment is due. It's worth, I believe, 10 points, 5 or 10 points. I think it's 5 points. It's the community selection and description paper. So if you remember from the syllabus, your largest assignment for the course is the community assessment paper. So this is where you're going to be looking at a specific population and problem within a specific community, and you're going to be completing a paper on it, kind of figuring out how can you solve this problem using specific interventions. So for this, what's due on February 1st is I need your topic, essentially. I need to know what you're going to be doing, because you're going to be using this topic to complete several important assignments. So in addition to the final paper of the course, you're going to be completing a windshield survey where you're going to be walking or driving around your community to understand the community's needs and strengths. You're going to be completing this needs assessment. You're going to be attending a community meeting. So all of these are kind of built around the topic that you choose. So it's important that you have close proximity to your community. If you're living in St. Louis, don't choose a community in Chicago unless you're going to be there over spring break. You probably don't want to do that. So what I need from you turned in by February 1st is roughly 1 page. Tell me what your community, population, and problem is, what those 3 things are, how are they related, and what is your evidence-based question that you're going to be answering. So if we think about, let's say, the community, make it kind of narrow, so it can be a specific zip code, a specific neighborhood. Probably don't choose the entire city of St. Louis. Instead, maybe choose the Dutchtown neighborhood of St. Louis. If you're thinking of a population, maybe I'm going to choose refugees. And the problem is that refugees have limited transportation within the Dutchtown neighborhood of St. Louis. So my question might be, how can transportation be more accessible for refugees in the Dutchtown neighborhood of St. Louis? And then I'm going to write a little paragraph about how they're all related and how this is a problem. So it's roughly a page. Turn it on Blackboard. The submission link is under the week 2 folder. And of course, please email me with any questions. I'm happy to look this over in advance if you have any trouble. Shoot me an email. I can meet in person. I can do a phone call. I can meet via Fuse if I can get it to work. I just want to make sure everyone completely understands what is being assigned here. So that is the end of our PowerPoint for today. Please let me know if you have any questions. As always, thank you.